So Tammy, if you're ready, it's all over to you.
Thank you, Liz. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah, I can.
Try to get a little closer.
That's better.
Thank you, and good morning, and welcome everyone to today's technical conference of the coordinated grid planning process. So as Liz mentioned, this is Tammy Mitchell. I'm the director of the Office of Electric, Gas, and Water at the Department of Public Service. As noted in the notice announcing today's conference, the purposes of this technical conference are to, one, explain and discuss the timing of the existing electric system planning cycles conducted by the New York State Independent System Operator and the New York utilities, and also to explore how those cycles might be aligned to support state policy goals, including NYSERDA's large-scale renewables procurement programs under the proposed coordinated grid planning process. So shortly, you'll be hearing presentations from the New York ISO, NYSERDA, and the joint utilities related to current planning processes, as well as proposed alignment of those processes through a coordinated grid planning process. I want to stress that today's technical conference is an opportunity for stakeholders to not only gain a better understanding
this is a message from Chase Bank
of the current planning processes and the proposal for alignment of those processes, but importantly, today's conference is an opportunity for stakeholders to meaningfully engage in the development of the transmission planning processes going forward. So on that note, I want to encourage everyone to participate, ask questions, make suggestions. Again, today's an opportunity to do that, and we want it to be interactive. So additionally, we want feedback on what issues stakeholders would like to explore further following the technical conference. We're open to convening small groups to focus on details of the planning cycles and process alignment. So please let us know your interest either during the technical conference or shortly afterward. So with that, I'll ask Jalila or Liz if there's anything else to add before we move on to the presentations.
Yeah, thanks, Tammy. I think, Jalila, can you just remind folks about where materials are posted and other logistics?
Sure, happy to. So the materials for today, which are the slides that the speakers will be using, they're already available in DMM, our Document and Matter Management System. After this conference, we'll also post a recording in DMM and also on the Coordinated Grid Planning Working Group webpage.
Great, thank you. And as far as Q&A, I think we are asking people to put their questions into the chat. Am I right about that, Jalila?
Sorry about that. I was on mute. Yes, that would be great if people could enter their questions into chat, and then we can also invite anyone on the phone who's not in WebEx on their computer to ask questions at the end.
Right. So I think the way we'll handle that is similar to what we did in the prior tech conference. We'll allow each presenter to make their presentation, pause for questions on that presentation, and then move to the next one. And then we hope to have some overall time for general Q&A at the conclusion. So that said, I think our first presenters are the New York Independent System Operator, and I'm looking for Zach Smith. Are you ready to go, Zach?
Yes, hi Liz, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Does one of us have to put up your slides?
I'm hoping so. So I don't have to figure it out.
This is Carl Peck, you're joining, just doing a sound check.
Yep, we got you, Carl.
Thank you.
Let's see. Jalila, do you have their stuff handy?
Sure, I can look for it, and unless Carl, if you have it handy, I'll look for it as well.
Great, thank you.
Otherwise, I can bring it up, Liz.
I don't know how to.
I'm mildly capable.
Well, I'm not sure how to transfer you. Can you share, or do I need to give you something?
Yeah. No, I think I'll be able to share. Just give me one moment.
Oh, super.
Okay, can folks see that?
I can, Zach, it's good.
Okay, I'll get started then.
Thank you.
Good morning, folks. I'm Zach Smith, Vice President of System Resource Planning at the New York ISO. Thank you to DPS for inviting us to speak at the tech conference. Very interested in continuing the discussion in terms of how best to plan the New York grid. As Liz described, and Tammy described, really my purpose of my presentation here today is just to help inform all of you as to our existing processes, especially as they relate to the bulk system, and highlight the timing of those processes, at least as they exist today, and hopefully use that to set the stage for establishing this coordinated grid planning process and how all the processes can mesh in the future going forward. So I'll talk a little bit about NISO's planning roles. I'll talk about our existing comprehensive system planning process. Really, the focus, as I just mentioned, is to talk through the timeline of our process. And then while it is preliminary at this point, there is a notice of proposed rulemaking from FERC that we feel is quite relevant to some of the discussions. So we just wanted to give a few summary points regarding that as the comment period is open for that NOPR right now. So New York ISO System Resource Planning, there's many things that we do. I'm only going to talk about some of them today. We comprehensively plan system and resources really for the entire bulk electric grid with an eye towards efficient markets. Of course, one of the main purposes of the NISO as a whole is operation of the wholesale electric markets in New York State, and really from a planning perspective then is to keep an eye on, do we have a reliable system? Is that system operating efficiently? And very appropriate for today's conversation, we plan for public policy needs and making sure that the system is well positioned to accommodate and achieve those public policies. Other aspects of system planning at the NISO, we have our entire interconnection process, all generation, load, transmission that interconnects to the New York grid is required to go through an interconnection process. I'm not going to be discussing that at all today, but that's a huge part of what we do. Relevant to what we will talk about today is our forecasting. We produce short-term and long-term forecasts, short-term being our daily forecasts, minute by minute, that go into system operations, all the way out to long-term forecasts that are out to 30 years and beyond at this point. We just recently published our 2022 Gold Book, or Load and Capacity Data Report, which has a lot of interesting information about the forecast and what the system may look like in the future, or at least demand behaviors, the impact of electric vehicles, electrification, all of that. I encourage anyone who's interested to check out our Gold Book that was recently published, and we'll also be summarizing some of that information in the NISO Power Trends to be published within the next few months. And then the bottom right corner of this slide really just covers a lot of what we do, and that's just being an authoritative source of information for all things related to the grid. And that probably has a lot to do with our presence here today. Of course, we have our official planning process that I'm about to talk through, but really, we work very closely with the utilities, with generators, with all market participants and all stakeholders in the New York grid to work towards an efficient grid and efficient operation of that grid. So specifically, thinking more in compliance terms, NISO's planning responsibility, for one, we have under our federal open access transmission tariff, there's many aspects of that tariff, but especially attachment Y establishes our planning process. It establishes requirements of the NISO, but also of transmission owners, of market participants, other interested parties. It lays out a comprehensive process, which I'm about to go through and summarize, related to the planning of the New York State bulk power transmission facilities. If you ever hear me say BPTFs, or you see that acronym, bulk power transmission facilities refers to a list of facilities that's codified under our tariff as defining the scope of the NISO planning process. And generally, it's 230 kV and above. There are some exceptions to that. And most notably on Long Island, the 138 kV system on Long Island is considered bulk power transmission. Related to reliability compliance, and especially Nerc Compliance, which is for North America, we are the designated planning coordinator and reliability coordinator for New York State, for the New York bulk electric system. That covers all facilities 100 kV and above. Basically what that means is we are the responsible entity that coordinates and integrates transmission facilities, plans, resource plans, and protection systems for everything 100 kV and above. As part of all of those processes, we have a variety of criteria, standards, rules that we must follow. Those are established by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, the Northeast Power Coordinating Council, or NPCC, and especially for New York, the New York State Reliability Council. That's something unique for New York. There's no other region in the US that has their own reliability council. So the New York State Reliability Council has the authority under a Federal Power Act to establish more stringent and more specific reliability rules compared to what, for example, what NERC may establish. In all of our planning studies, we take into consideration really all kinds of things, but notably and especially relevant for today's conversation, federal, state, local laws and regulations. Of course, the forecast that I mentioned, what resources we anticipate having on the system, what their availability will be, what our forecasted expansions are of the system, and really what all of the needs will be related to all of that. All of our planning processes involve many stakeholder meetings, and I anticipate that most people on this tech conference today are well aware of the NISO stakeholder process. For planning, we have two primary stakeholder forums: Transmission Planning Advisory Subcommittee, or TPAS, and the Electric System Planning Working Group, or ESPWG. Those meet usually twice a month. And then anything that's subject to approval, which would really be any of our planning studies, those go through various committees, some of which are for operating committee, some of which are for the business issues committee, and then many, if not all of them, go to the management committee. Then any larger reports, such as the reliability needs assessment or comprehensive reliability plan, which I'll discuss in a moment, those all go up to the NISO Board of Directors for approval. So let me speak about specifically the comprehensive system planning process established by the NISO's tariff. There are more details that I put in the appendices of my slides, but I didn't want to take all the time today to walk through all of these details. So when the material is posted, I encourage attendees that if you have questions about any of the details of what I have on this slide, check out the appendices of my slides. And then, of course, if you're really interested, check out our website for much more information on any of this. But this slide really covers the main aspects of the comprehensive system planning process. First, and very importantly, is the local transmission owner planning process, or if you hear us say LTPs or LTPP, that acronym, that's what we're referring to. Every transmission owner or utility in New York has an obligation under our federal tariffs to present to stakeholders their local plans and for that to be incorporated into our process. I do have a few detailed slides on that, so I'll come back to that. All of those local TO plans then feed into our three primary parts of the comprehensive system planning process. We have the reliability planning process, which consists of these primary reports. We have short-term assessments of reliability that are conducted on a quarterly basis. We have the reliability needs assessment, which is conducted biennially in even years. So this is an RNA year for us. We will be publishing that in November. And then the comprehensive reliability plan follows the reliability needs assessment that establishes the plan for New York State reliability for the next 10 years. Under our economic planning process, we produce a 20-year outlook evaluating system performance, system efficiency, really economic opportunities for transmission, and just to give guidance for stakeholders and policymakers as to what the future could look like. Stay tuned for that. That's expected to be published within the next few months. And then we have the public policy transmission planning process, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. This is the process from which we had the Western New York public policy awarded to NextEra, and AC transmission public policies awarded to Alice Power, NYPA, and New York Transco. All of those transmission projects are under construction right now and on schedule to get into service. The idea with all of those transmission projects is to achieve public policies in the state and to build transmission to achieve those policies. And of course, we have one underway right now, and that is a transmission need to provide for export of power off of Long Island, really delivering offshore wind that's expected to be built and connected to Long Island. And one kind of wrapper around this entire process is interregional planning. We work very closely with our neighbors, especially ISO New England and PJM, in staying coordinated in our planning and what our findings are. And those joint interregional findings are taken into consideration in each one of these processes that I just described. So on this slide, it lays out from a procedural standpoint sort of what the comprehensive system planning process looks like. You can see here at the top that as an input to the process, we take into consideration interconnection studies, the interregional process that I just mentioned, all the demand and capacity forecasts, and then very important for today, the local transmission owner plans. All of that is fed into our comprehensive system planning process that then operates on these steps here, and I won't walk through all of that. Specifically to local planning, just to emphasize this because it is very relevant to today's conversation. Under our tariff, the transmission owners are responsible for planning their local systems within their districts and developing the local plans. All voltage levels, all voltage classes of transmission are applicable under this LTP. One thing that is important to identify, certainly the value to the Cgpp that's being discussed here today, is that local planning process does not encompass distribution planning. So, as we think about the processes and how they mesh together, our overall process plans out the system down to at least 100 kV, if not below that, but it does not get into the distribution system of the New York grid. Under those tariffs, FERC requires that transmission owners and the NYSO follow a variety of requirements, especially focused on openness and transparency, that were established by Orders 890 and 1000, roughly 10 to 15 years ago. And any variations from those tariffs would require FERC acceptance. So that we just wanted to note that relevant to today's conversation. We anticipate that, part of the conversation will be, well, what's the most efficient process? What's the best way to plan the New York grid? NYSO is open to any ideas as to how things can be done better. And if what we collectively identify as the best way to plan the system means having to change the tariff, well, we're open to entertaining that discussion, but we do have to recognize that it may require that if changes are required, it would require FERC approval to do so. Under those requirements, it's worth noting some points on this slide that the TOs are responsible to identify and evaluate solutions to any identified needs. These include solutions proposed by market participants. So that is a requirement under the tariff that market participants have the opportunity to offer solutions. And if they do, then the TOs must consider them. The TOs must consider whether there are needs driven by public policy requirements. And if they identify needs driven by public policy requirements, they must discuss that with DPS and then take into consideration any comments from the market participants or any other parties. And once they've done all of that, then to discuss that through the NYSO stakeholder process. They must present draft local transmission plans. They must describe what the planning criteria and assumptions are that drive those plans and those needs. They must describe any analytical tools that they're using, and all of that is subject to NISO stakeholder discussions. Then any local solution that's identified by a TO to address a need, including anything driven by public policies, that'll all be, any solutions are all reviewed by stakeholders. And it is worth noting that for the NISO public policy process, for example, there is a formal solicitation. There is not a formal solicitation requirement within our tariff for the local planning process, but TOs, as I noted, still must evaluate solutions proposed by market participants if they are proposed. And I've already touched on this. Once all of those LTPs are established, they get documented in our Gold Book that was just published, and then they are fed into our unified planning model for the New York transmission system, and thus represented in all of our studies. It gets, our models themselves get all the way down to 11 kV, but as I noted, our planning responsibilities go down to roughly 100 kV exceptions. So really the highlight and relevant to the overall concept today, and thinking about how the processes mesh together and the timelines. There's a lot on this slide, but hopefully it's useful. Just to orient everyone, so on the left, you'll see a timeline. We laid it out just for the next few years, 2022, 23, 24, by quarter, and key milestones that happen every quarter relevant to any given process. So the first column is data collection. We have our system modeling responsibilities at the NISO. Every year, on April 1st, we must file with FERC what's called a FERC 715 filing. The main part of that are models that represent the entire New York system over a series of years. We work closely with the utilities on that. It actually is done on behalf of the utilities. It is the utilities' responsibility for that FERC 715, but given the NISO's central responsibilities as planning coordinator, reliability coordinator, we actually make that filing on behalf of the utilities. And that, as I've mentioned, is done hand in hand with our Gold Book that basically puts into documentation what our models represent. I'll also note under this data column that every year, right around the fourth quarter, really as input and lead up to that FERC 715 filing that I just described, every year the TOs present local transmission plan updates to stakeholders. And as I've described, those plans then get documented in the Gold Book and rolled into our FERC 715 databases. So the reason I have those highlighted on here is anticipation of some of what else will be discussed today at the tech conference. Where are the meshing points? Where are important milestones to keep in mind as you think through the process? What processes are established, and where do they need to meet? And this is one milestone that we cannot move. The FERC 715 filing must be done April 1st every year, and in order to do that, some of these steps that come before it must also happen in that time frame. Moving to the next column, Nerc Compliance, the NISO and the TOs all have compliance responsibilities for planning the system. Without discussing the details of that at all, there's a lot of work that happens throughout every year for that, but it does culminate in planning assessments that must be done. I forget the exact date, but I believe it's in the June-July timeframe. NISO as planning coordinator coordinates that, but many responsibilities by the TOs to feed into those planning assessments. So that's done on an annual basis. Now moving more into our tariff-based planning for reliability. We have the reliability needs assessment that's done biennially and completed in the November timeframe of any even year. Once we finalize that, if we have reliability needs that we've identified, we provide an opportunity for updates, and that's relevant to thinking about local planning. We take into consideration updates from the TOs and any other stakeholders, and any updates that meet our RNA base case inclusion rules, they get fed in, and we think about, do we still have reliability needs or not? If we do still have reliability needs, we would conduct the Order 1000 solicitation process to identify the more efficient or cost-effective solutions to the reliability needs. But whether we have needs or not, it always culminates in a comprehensive reliability plan. And then after that, the cycle starts all over again. So there in the tariff, there is nothing that establishes set dates for that, but the tariff does define that be on a 2-year cycle. And this is roughly the 2-year cycle that we've established. Next column over just acknowledges that the quarterly STARS, the short-term assessments of reliability, those are produced every quarter and taken into consideration.
I'm sorry, I was away for about maybe 10 minutes and then I came back. Yeah. But I heard first.
Someone's off mute.
Yeah, folks need to stay muted. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Economic planning process. I won't spend much time on this, but what is relevant is our 20-year outlook, and the rough timing of when that gets produced is around the June timeframe, June-July timeframe. And as I think you'll hear from the TOs, there's some thoughts as to how that could get utilized to inform assumptions in planning. And then the public policy planning process, a key aspect that's a milestone is every August, not every August, every 2 years in August, so every even year in August, we are required to ask stakeholders for what public policies may drive the need for transmission. Once we get those comments, we then NISO files those comments with the PSC, and the PSC then issues a SAPA notice seeking comments on the proposed public policies that may drive the need for transmission. If there are any needs that the PSC identifies, they would issue an order, and then we would act on that to seek solutions to address that public policy need. Finally, to tie into the rest of this tech conference, this final column, you'll notice it doesn't have any tie-in from a timing standpoint, but this just acknowledges the responsibilities that the TOs have under our tariff to plan for public policy and to identify what public policy requirements drive needs on their system. Everything, of course, this is shorthand. There's a section of our tariff that lays this out in detail. Those requirements have been there since Order 1000 was finalized around 8 to 10 years ago. So with that, that's our process that's been in place for some time. But as I noted at the beginning, there is a recent notice of proposed rulemaking that FERC put out. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but I think it's worthwhile that the audience here is aware of it. So on April 21st, FERC issued a NOPR. We've noted here it's long anticipated because FERC first issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking last year. In that advance notice of proposed rulemaking, it proposed many changes to all things planning, including interconnection process. This recent NOPR is a subset of what was in the advance notice of proposed rulemaking. Among the proposals, we in our slides here, we did not attempt to cover the entire NOPR, but really just highlight aspects that may be relevant to today's conversation. Among the proposals, FERC proposes to require a long-term regional transmission planning process. It really is an extension. I have a slide on that. It's an extension on our current planning process. They propose to expand evaluation metrics. They propose to enhance some of the local transmission planning requirements, and they propose a concept of right-sizing transmission solutions. So in terms of the long-term regional planning, they propose a longer time period. Right now, our planning process covers 10 years for reliability, sort of 20 years for economic planning, and I can clarify that if people are interested. And then for public policy, our public policy process actually does cover what FERC is proposing here, to look at 20 years of a transmission project being in service. the next number of bullets really is the major highlight of the NOPR, and that is the proposal to do scenario planning. And to do that scenario planning consistent with federal, state, and local laws and regulations, and to take those into consideration, evaluate various scenarios, considering aging resources, retirements, considering interconnection requests that have happened and what upgrades are associated with those, taking into consideration any utility commitments, also taking into consideration resiliency, such as high impact, low frequency, extreme weather events. So FERC is proposing that the NISO and the entire NISO planning process, which would include the TOs, that it take into consideration all of these scenarios. So that would be a major change to our existing planning process. Whatever transmission solutions may come out of that scenario analysis would be affected by what FERC proposes for metrics used to identify benefits. I don't have them all listed here, but they do propose to expand the benefits. They also touch upon cost allocation and the importance for the role of the states. New York, in New York's case, a single state ISO, and how the New York DPS and PSC would have a say in cost allocation. It also touches upon rights of first refusal that the utilities will have.
那好啊，那他对现在这个还有
Someone needs to be on mute.
Reminder to please remain muted while the speakers are speaking.
Thanks, Liz. Relevant to today also, the NOPR touches upon local planning requirements. They specifically define a series of 3 meetings that must be held and the topics that must be discussed in those meetings. The first meeting would be an assumptions meeting to share with stakeholders what assumptions will be used, what models will be used for planning. Then there would be a needs meeting associated with what needs have been identified and give stakeholders an opportunity to comment on that. And then following that, there would be a solutions meeting describing any solutions that have been identified by TOs and giving stakeholders an opportunity to comment on that. So really, when you read through the NOPR, and you look at some of these requirements, obviously we've shorthanded them here, but the highlight is openness and transparency, and establishing a process through, in the New York's case, what would be the NISO stakeholder process, a process for being open and transparent and talking through assumptions, needs, and solutions. Given how specific FERC is, granted it is just a notice of proposed rulemaking at this point and not an actual order, but given how specific FERC is in these requirements, it's worth being mindful of some of these if they ultimately do turn into requirements from a FERC order. Perhaps being mindful of how to structure the coordinated grid planning process, or how to structure any changes to the local planning process such that they could fit within the requirements that FERC may establish in the near future. Another interesting aspect of the NOPR is the idea of right-sizing transmission, the idea that rather than sizing them to their bare minimum, do you think to the future and think about how the system may evolve over time, and is it better to right-size transmission solutions to be prepared for the future rather than doing the bare minimum of what's needed today just to have to come back and replace it later on? That's, in a nutshell, the theme from FERC on this idea of right-sizing transmission solutions. So, like I said, I thought it'd be useful for this audience to be aware of that as we're thinking about what the coordinated grid planning process looks like. The schedule of this: initial comments are due to FERC on July 18th. Reply comments to that will be August 17th. FERC has indicated, although there's nothing set in stone about this, they've indicated they will issue a final order by the end of 2022. That would set the timeline then, as we expect at least, that compliance filings would be due for that order in 2023. So really what that means is it puts us on a timeline that we anticipate whatever the new requirements will be and whatever new planning processes that come out of FERC's action could very well be effective sometime in 2024. And that is my presentation. As I noted, I have a variety of appendices that cover a few things in more detail, but I will stop right there and see what questions there are.
Great. Thank you, Zach. This is Liz, and thanks for that preview of the of the FERC NOPR. It's always good to see the federal government thinking about some of the same problems we're thinking about.
Liz, it's Carl. Did you want me to try to, there's a question in the chat. Do you want us to try to answer that now?
Yes, there is a question in the chat. You could probably see it, Carl, and I was gonna throw it to you. So you want to give a shot?
Sure. Good morning, Ann. Nice to hear you. Appreciate your question. Generally speaking, the New York TOs have authority and responsibility to plan for their local transmission systems to meet their local system needs in their transmission districts. So with some limited exceptions, the NISO stakeholders don't reject transmission owners' local transmission plans. There are two circumstances in which the NISO can review a TO local transmission plan. We can indicate that we are not in agreement with it if it's being proposed to meet a local reliability need, and we think it doesn't meet the reliability need, and then we would seek to resolve that with a local TO. There's one provision in our tariff for that. And the other thing that the NISO does for local transmission plans is to review those plans to determine if there is a regional solution that may be more efficient or cost effective to meet local transmission system needs in local transmission districts than separate local transmission solutions. The NISO does that for informational purposes only. We don't tell the TOs that they must adopt a regional solution. We provide that for informational purposes. And it's important to recognize also that the NISO doesn't select local transmission solutions for cost allocation, cost recovery purposes. We only do that for regional transmission needs and transmission solutions. So I hope that helps answer your question. Let me know if you have any follow-ups.
Yeah, I think it does. I was responding to Zach's slide about I forget the slide number. So it sounds like the ISO discusses those proposed local transmission system projects and can identify if they disagree or advise if there's a regional solution, but they don't approve or disapprove of them. Do I have that right? Yeah,
That's correct. When it comes to, there are certain circumstances in which, for example, if there's a solution to reliability needs, we accept all non-BPTF solutions from the TOs. If the TOs offer bulk power transmission solutions to reliability needs, we take those that are firm and will be in service in 3 years, so that the local solutions don't, preempt the entire long-term transmission need. But that's a little bit in the weeds. But for the most part, no, we're not in a position where we reject those local transmission plans. But as Zach indicated, there's openness and transparency requirements to review those with stakeholders and get their input.
got it. Thanks so much.
You're welcome, Ann.
Okay. Okay, it's Liz. I'm not seeing any other questions for the moment for Zach.
Can I ask a follow-up to Carl's comment?
Sure. And then somebody did just drop a question in. So, yep.
It's John Cordy with the New York Power Authority. I just wanted to follow up, Carl. I think you answered my primary question, but I just want to make sure I heard you correctly, that the reviews that you do of the TOLTPs, looking to see if they meet the need and or if there is a regional solution that may be a better solution, are those public, and where would I find those?
Well, the local transmission plans are posted on the NISO's website. The local transmission plans that we accept into the NISO's short-term reliability process and into its reliability planning process are provided in the presentations that go over the assumptions that underlie the quarterly reliability assessments we do for the 5-year period, and the assumptions matrices that are provided for the 10-year reliability needs assessment. So you would find all those assumptions about LTPs in the assumptions for the quarterly assessments and for the once every 2-year reliability assessment.
Carl, I was specifically asking about the NISO's review and an assessment of what's being submitted in the LTPs. Are those?
We discussed that with the TOs at ESPWG with all the stakeholders, and go over that, and then we review those assumptions, and those then go into the reliability study.
Okay,
There's no one place where there's a repository of local transmission plan discussions.
In other words, we don't like document formal comments. I suppose we could if there was a significant issue, but as Carl described, really what we leave it to is the open discussion at ESPWG where we also make comments and ask questions when the LTPs are being presented.
Okay, that was the response I was looking for. It's not really written up and included in it. It's not available. And just one final question: when it's evaluating a regional, does the NISO comment on, include in its assessment, any differentiation between local transmission and bulk transmission?
Do you mean by voltage class, John?
By voltage class, or by FERC or PSC jurisdictionality.
The jurisdiction question is a complicated one. Carl could take a shot at it if he wanted to, but I'll say from a local versus bulk, as I noted on one of my slides, the tariff has a defined term of bulk power transmission facilities. There's a very specific list of what those facilities are, and as transmission facilities change or new ones are built, then that list gets updated. But the general rule again is bulk power transmission facilities subject to our comprehensive system planning process under the tariff are generally 230 kV and above and 138 kV and above for Long Island. For reliability compliance purposes, the voltage level goes down to 100 kV. But I think our tariff process is more relevant to today's conversation, and for that, that's the dividing line basically.
Yeah, and I don't want to bring the meeting into a tangent. So thank you, Zach. I really appreciate the response.
Yep.
So it's Liz. I have accumulated a couple more questions. Someone has a question about something on your slide 18. Could the questioner unmute to say what the question is?
Yeah, good morning. This is Ashu from AES. I actually had two questions. Maybe I can go first with the 20-year transmission plan. So let's say there's a transmission project that gets approved. And then, I don't know, is NISO going to evaluate that project every 2 years? And then if circumstances change, is there a possibility or a risk of that project being canceled?
I think it's a great question. So the slides that I presented here are just a summary of FERC's notice of proposed rulemaking. It doesn't even include NISO's thoughts on that NOPR, let alone how we would propose to comply with it if it turned into an order. So it's a great question. Today we don't have an answer to that, or really any question regarding how we may comply with with the NOPR if it turned into an order. But it is a great question, something worthwhile for anyone to think about as you consider comments to file with FERC, and also to keep in mind that if you assume that this turns into some type of order from FERC, that will lead to many stakeholder conversations in the NISO stakeholder process about how NISO proposes to comply with that. So anyone who has any thoughts, any questions at all about that, please stay tuned. I expect it's going to be a significant part of our stakeholder conversations for the next 2 years.
Thank you. My second question regarding, and thanks for bringing up slide 18. So on the right-hand side, where you have generator interconnection requests and withdrawals due to costly system upgrades, how do you envision NISO looking into this?
Yep. Another great question and same answer. This is one of the slides summarizing the notice of proposed rulemaking. We haven't given it thought yet how we would comply. That being said, I'll try to hit two birds with one stone here. I see in the chat someone asked about as a generation developer, the upgrades and issues that they have to face in the interconnection process, and then thinking about the transmission planning process. I know from reading the NOPR that what FERC intends and what we were summarizing with this bullet is if system upgrades have been identified a number of times through interconnection studies, but perhaps the generator who would be responsible for the cost allocation in that instance, maybe they rejected their cost allocation because it's just too much of an upgrade for them alone to bear the cost for. FERC's idea is, well, if you've had upgrades like that identified multiple times, maybe that's a leading indicator that you ought to plan ahead for those transmission upgrades. And then to directly answer the question that I see in the chat, I see a lot of promise in at least some of what's contemplated here in the NOPR, where, if we as the NISO had the ability to do a little bit more proactive planning and to position the system to be better prepared for the resource mix changes in the future, I anticipate that would lead to a more efficient interconnection process as well. That if we could plan for transmission facilities to accommodate a certain amount of new resources and to provide effectively efficient points of interconnection for them, well, then in turn, the interconnection process would likely go much more smoothly because you would have already planned for that. So much more to come on that, at least I anticipate, based on what I read in the NOPR. But I do get the sense that's where FERC is leading with it.
Hey, Zach, it's Liz. I want to add on to that. The focus of our conference here is the state's coordinated grid planning process, which is going to take up that issue about how do we plan transmission so as to facilitate interconnection. So that's something that the planning process we're looking at now is concerned with. The fact that FERC has put out a notice and is considering asking transmission providers to do, to take into account these factors, it's great news. But everybody at this conference should understand that the state is already moving forward with the Cgpp to address that problem. And that's really the focus of our discussion here. What Zach is giving everybody is a preview of stuff that's coming from FERC that we hope is going to mesh very well with the stuff that we're working on in the Cgpp.
Thanks, Liz. You just said what I was going to emphasize. I'll go ahead and emphasize it anyway. Exactly. I think that it's great that the state is taking steps to get out in front of these issues. And as I read the NOPR, I think there's a lot of opportunity for us collectively to figure out a process that will fit right in with what FERC is contemplating. So I'd be, in a different hypothetical, I'd be very worried if FERC was proposing something that was entirely different than what we're discussing here. But I don't see that that's necessarily the case. So I think it's great news and part of the reason why I wanted to highlight it. So thanks for emphasizing that, Liz.
Yep, no, that's really, we don't want to lose sight. We're trying to make progress on exactly those issues, and I think all of these strands have come together. Couple more questions. One is concerning LTPs. The question is, if LTPs become firm before they are presented to stakeholders, can you include them in study cases, or can they only be included in studies after presentation to the stakeholders? Can you answer that one, Zach?
We would, here's how I would word that. We would make sure that it gets presented to stakeholders, when they become firm. So, if we become aware of an LTP that is firm, we may be wrapping them into cases, but we'll also be asking the TO to make sure that it gets presented to stakeholders. So it's kind of thing that happens really at the same time. And the TOs are good about that. I don't mean to imply that that's a difficult step to have or something like that. The TOs are well aware that if we make something firm, then part of that process is to go to stakeholders and discuss it.
Great, thank you. And Rhodika Donaldson also had a question that I think is pertinent. Looking at the CGPP, what's your view, Zach, for the NISO, of the best approach for bulk solutions to be evaluated through declaring public policy needs in parallel or with a bulk evaluation component? Can you respond to that? I think that's a very timely question.
Yeah, it is a timely question. I'm not sure I have the greatest answer for it at this time, simply because I think that's what we need to keep talking through. I'll say something that many of you have heard me say before. There's NISO has no pride of ownership or authorship when it comes to the planning process. Really, my focus with my presentation here today is to help all of you, understand and be aware of what our obligations are, but also, as I already noted, to acknowledge that we're always open to change if that change makes sense. So really, our interest is working together with the state, with the utilities, and with all stakeholders to find, well, what's the most efficient way from a process standpoint to then get to the most efficient grid from an engineering standpoint. And I certainly think that the NISO's planning process is a very useful tool in that toolbox, where I think that, when you're looking at large-scale transmission projects, and especially transmission projects that span across the system, I think that's especially where the NISO process can be quite useful. You're seeing that right now with the Long Island offshore wind export public policy transmission need, looking at transmission solutions to resolve constraints between Long Island and the rest of New York State for the sake of helping to deliver offshore wind. So, I think that's a good example of, one could argue there may have been other ways that could have been achieved, but I think, in my opinion, that the NISO's public policy process is a very efficient way from a procedural standpoint to get to a very efficient outcome from an engineering standpoint. And so I feel like we provide some very useful tools in the toolbox, but by no means are we the sole place to go to. I think really what we're interested in is just doing everything efficiently, both from a process and engineering perspective.
Thanks, Zach. And this is Liz. I'll answer the question also from the Commission and staff perspective, which is that, the challenge the Commission gave to the TOs and stakeholders with the CGPP was to coordinate planning processes so as to give the Commission on a regular basis a view of all the system needs, including bulk system needs. So we definitely want to figure out the best mechanism for getting that information in front of the Commission, as I said, on a regular and useful schedule. So I think there was one other question about, has NISO thought about how to implement the meshed grid? And that might be a little premature, Zach. I'm not sure if you can answer that or not.
I think it is premature. I'll not go into details except to acknowledge that, yes, absolutely, we're thinking about it. I think our interconnection process is poised to be able to handle it. But that being said, I think there's certainly some very unique complications that we need to take into consideration that just really haven't realized before. For anyone, I'm assuming everyone's aware of the reference, but what the discussion is for offshore wind. You have many offshore wind proposed interconnections right now, which are radial, just basically extension cords from the offshore wind generators onto land. And the thought is, wouldn't it be more efficient, again, from an engineering perspective, wouldn't it be more efficient to have a meshed offshore grid to optimize the delivery of that offshore wind to the land-based grid? As NISO has stated in a variety of forums and comments, we do believe that the mesh grid would be an efficient approach to integrating offshore wind, and therefore we really want to work on overcoming any challenges associated with that. But yeah, there will be some detailed issues when it comes to the interconnection process and how to handle that, and that's a little premature right now to discuss those details.
Thanks. I think we had a comment from John Cordy about projects languishing in the queue. It might also not be economic. Yeah, we're very mindful of that potential, John, in looking at how to coordinate transmission investment with the generation build out. So yes, we're concerned about that. I don't think we have any other questions in the chat. Oops. Looks like we just got one from Anne. Regarding interaction between the PPTN and Cgpp, if Cgpp results in a recommended bulk project, does that then commence? So Anne, I'm gonna answer that. We haven't scoped out the exact mechanism, but we definitely, on the staff side, we definitely think that we could use the Cgpp to trigger a commission decision to ask the NISO to run a solicitation. So information coming out of the Cgpp would give the commission the basis for starting the PPTN process. And we think that we should explore efficient ways of doing that, and aligning the routine PPTN cycle with the outputs of the Cgpp. Does that answer your question?
It definitely answers the first half of it. Thanks, Liz. I guess I'm wondering the pros and cons of doing it on a parallel track, just in the interest of time. So if you started the PPTN process and then if the grid planning process identified a need for a bulk project, then you would have that underway already in terms of some projects being proposed.
Yeah, well, I think that's an alignment question, and it's one that we want to get people's thoughts on. How do we build that mechanism? Where do we put it? When do we pull the trigger? That's I think that's to be discussed. But our initial view is that instead of having the NISO open up a PPTN. Who thinks that there are public policy needs out there? Instead of starting from there, that we should start from data coming out of the Cgpp.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it can go. The good news is the tariff is flexible. I mean, once every 2 years, we have to ask for public policy needs and submit them to the PSC. But the PSC can decide to determine needs at that time, or they can decide to declare needs in an off-cycle process at a different time frame based upon the Cgpp. It's really up to the PSC's authority to decide the needs.
Got it. Thank you.
But
I know this is probably it might be in the schedule. Sitting where you are now, the output of that Cgpp would be at the end of 2023 or mid 2023.
Yeah, so we're probably going to talk about this some more when we hear from the utilities. So do you mind if we hold that question?
No, don't mind at all. Sorry.
But it's a good question. With that, I think we'd like to go to NYSERDA's presentation. I hope that Zach's presentation gave everybody a sense of the complexity of what they do, as well as some of the timing cycles that are implicated under their tariffs. And NYSERDA has a short presentation on some of the timing on their procurement process. So Dave Crudelli, are you going to be giving that presentation?
Yes, I am, Liz.
Great. And am I sharing your slides?
Yes, I am seeing it.
Do you want me to do that?
Yeah, that'd be great. It's just I just have a few slides, so that's probably the easiest way to move forward.
Okay, so thanks, Dave. And off we go.
All right, thanks, Liz, and good morning, everyone. I'm Dave Cordelli with NYSERDA's Large Scale Renewables team. You can think of us as the team at NYSERDA that is working to transform New York's utility scale energy generation system to achieve the state's goal of 70% renewable energy by 2030. And so really what that means is our team is trying to build the ecosystem to create onshore wind and solar at utility scale, as well as we run the hydroelectric programs for the existing hydroelectric resources, and we have the offshore wind program in New York State. And really for our purposes, we see the Cgpp as most directly impacting and benefiting the land-based wind and solar program, or what we often call Tier 1. And that's because that's how it's referred to in the Clean Energy Standard, the CES. And NYSERDA is a little bit different than the ISO or the utilities that you'll hear from today. We really see ourselves as more of consumers of this information rather than creators of the information, but it does fit into our process. And really, thanks, Liz, for advancing that slide. There's three main places that we see this fitting into our process. And two of them are really for informing the project developers who may come and bid in our solicitations. So we put out an annual solicitation in the Tier 1 program, and that's really a solicitation where we will buy the renewable energy credits over a long time frame that come from the renewable generation being built. Without getting too far into the weeds, there are a lot of steps that developers take before they ever come to us, and before they bring a potential project to us and bid into our solicitation. And so we see the information coming out of the Cgpp as helping them, helping the developer community even before they even get to us. And then we have a two-step solicitation process in the Tier 1 program. And so we see this information being helpful, again, coming back in on the second step of that process. And then finally, during our technical evaluation panel. So Liz, if you advance to the next slide, there's a timeline of sort of how we see this all fit together. You can see the timeline. This is a roughly 1 year timeline for a typical annual Tier 1 RFP. I want to caveat it that really anything I'm saying today is how we typically run things, but there are small adjustments that are made from year to year, including on timing. So really, while this is indicative of what we do each year, the place for actual RFP information will be when the RFP is released, and then in the bidders conference that happens each year around the RFP. So this is really just indicative, but I talked about those three places where we see the Cgpp really being interactive with our process. And the first one is off to the left side of this slide, months to even years before a developer comes to us and with a bid. And that's really helping them identify sites that they think are worthy of getting further development, of putting more resources into them, where their project can be deliverable and face the lowest possible interconnection costs. And then coming in and bidding into our solicitation, like as I mentioned, we have a two-step bid process. Step one is an application that ensures that the resource is eligible under the solicitation, and it starts to frame out what that project looks like. And then later in that bid process, typically in the August and September timeframe, there is the step 2 process, and that's where project information is more specific, and so that's the place where we see really the Cgpp information being used by the developers that have come into that year's annual solicitation as being really helpful for them to decide if they're going to continue on with that bid and continue to put resources to it or not. And then finally, in the bid evaluation process that NYSERDA covers, this is in the October-November timeframe. This is where NYSERDA will actually take the Cgpp information and use it in-house as part of our evaluation of those bids and a part of the awarding process. And really what that means is it will be part of the project viability and operational flexibility analysis that we do. And that really looks at, can the energy from the project be delivered? And where is that project in terms of peak coincidence with peak load in the state? I should mention that the CGPP is going to pull together a lot of the different pieces of information that we want to look at in the bid evaluation process, but it's really not the only thing we would be looking at. We do intake pretty much all of the publicly available grid information that's out there from the ISO, from the utilities, and anything that's on the Public Service Commission's Case 20E 0197 docket. So with that, that's really, in a nutshell, how we see the CGPP interacting with NYSERDA's annual Tier 1 solicitation process.
Is there another slide?
That's it.
That's it. Okay. That was a really nice illustration. I'm going to see if we have any questions for you. Not seeing anything directed to NYSERDA. Speak up if I missed somebody.
Hi, yes, I had sent a question to Jalila. This is Ed Stoutbrick. I was curious if he could, if Dave could elaborate on the Tier 1 RECs on the index process and, what that covers and what sort of tenors they're seeing.
I'd be happy to elaborate on that, but that's probably pretty far afield from our purposes today.
Okay, sure.
I'll put my email address in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me directly.
Thank you. I'll do that.
Thanks, Dave. That's a great idea. Stop sharing. But I think that the comment I want to make about your presentation is it was very helpful to show where the informational inputs are needed. I think the trick we're engaged in here is figuring out how many process milestones are written in stone, so to speak, and how many are movable, so that at the end of the day we have several processes that all support each other and support everybody's timing needs. I think that's really kind of the magic that we're hoping to figure out. I'm going to suggest a 5 or 6 minute break and then start the utility presentation. So I will go on mute until 11:14, and then we'll start back up again. All right. Thanks, everybody. Be right back.
Hello.
So, hi, we're just on a short break. Going to resume in a minute. Okay, good afternoon, or good morning again. It's Liz Rosaro with DPS and ready to resume our tech conference on planning processes and the CGPP. Our third and last presentation comes from the utilities who have put at least some of their proposed process details into the filing they made last December. So we will turn to that next. And who is presenting for the utilities?
Good morning, Liz. This is Nicholas Culpepper. I'll be presenting.
Hi, Nick. Great. Good to hear from you. Can you pull up your slides?
Yeah, sure. Give me two.
Great.
Yeah.
Wait a minute, let's see. Maybe I have them. I'll let you do it, Chris, because I want you to control the flow. Is that all right?
Oh, sorry. You wanted me to display, Liz?
Well, I think it'd be better if you could control the flow.
Yeah, that's fine. And can people see my screen?
We can see it, Nick.
Yep.
All right, great. So as mentioned, my name is Nicholas Culpepper. I'm with PSCG Long Island. Today, I'm going to be presenting on behalf of LIPA and the JU. This presentation brings about the latest in a series of technical conferences that are planned for this year. And as previously mentioned, it looks to focus on a process alignment of the utility proposed CGPP with the New York ISO and NYSERDA existing efforts. So today's planned agenda will look to build upon that last technical conference, starting with the review of the existing planning processes. From there, we'll move on to a review of the proposed CGPP framework and the individual stages that make up that framework. Those individual stages will then segue into a slide on potential touch points that showcase process alignment with relevant New York ISO processes and the NYSERDA procurement process. And then lastly, we wanted to discuss the anticipated evolution of the CGPP before moving on to questions.
Great.
So this slide is essentially a recap of the last technical conference on existing local planning processes. Some key takeaways from this slide are each of the respective studies listed at the top start with the current New York ISO database, which is used for case development and contingency analysis. The primary focus of these studies are operational and reliability related, including some regulatory efforts. And then identified needs from relevant studies get incorporated into a long-range development plan on an annual basis. And then in turn, that long-range development plan feeds into local transmission plans that gets updated on a biennial basis. And that's presented publicly to stakeholders, as Zach previously mentioned, at TPAS, typically done in the fall. And then beyond that, and I think this was already hit on as well, as needed, those local transmission plans are updated outside of that set schedule by the utilities when projects become firm. So these efforts here are supported locally by each utility. though some may be communicated to other entities. And then the CGPP is in addition to and not a replacement of these efforts. Though it's recognized that it may inform and support them as applicable. So this slide captures regional planning processes that the utilities support in one fashion or another and or coordinate with the New York ISO on. I don't really see a need to go through this slide in great deal, having Zach done an excellent job of presenting a comprehensive presentation for the New York ISO with equivalent information. But so some key takeaways as it relates to the utility proposed CGPP would be, of course, the New York ISO database as a primary source for local studies, the biennial public policy process, which addresses needs identified at the state level for the bulk electric system. Generation additions are incorporated into the interconnection process, as we understand. And then generation deactivations are studied as part of the quarterly STAR effort. And a note there is, which we've been experiencing an increase in need for support by the utilities in that regard. So this slide presents an overview of the proposed CGPP framework filed in December of last year. We're looking at a 24-month timeline for a full cycle of CGPP, and that will be better understood in later slides when you go into a little bit more detail. Some updates have been made to, one, fit the flow chart into this presentation, but also some minor changes based on ongoing discussions with staff, the New York ISO, and NYSERDA. The CGPP is envisioned as a new planning process that better supports local public policy planning and coordinates with both bulk transmission and distribution planning. And all of that's done while being informed by stakeholder engagement. So the CGPP will facilitate the identification and development of local public policy projects to meet CLCPA objectives. And the utilities will develop a holistic planning procedure to enable New York's clean energy transition. And this is for submission by the end of this year. The CGPP will facilitate NYSERDA procurement and harmonize individual system studies. And it aims to produce a least cost statewide investment plan for ratepayers. This slide represents just a high-level overview of the individual stages and steps that will be discussed in greater detail in the following slides. At a high level, this consists of capacity expansion and the selection of capacity expansion scenarios, the development of nodal representation models for those CapEx scenarios chosen, local system studies, local and statewide synergies, with an aim to mitigate adverse impact and minimize curtailment with least cost solutions. Statewide system study report with respect to review is also incorporated here, along with the least cost plan assessment of solutions identified. And finally, a least cost plan report of phase 2 projects to be considered for approval by the PSC. So the proposed CGPP kicks off with stage 1. And actually, this is a good place to point out as relevant to earlier questions or concerns of transmission expansion to support CLCPA objectives. I think that was a question earlier in chat. Here in stage 1, this consists of capacity expansion modeling for those resources and the selection of CapEx scenarios as well, whereby we envision that the Energy Policy Planning Advisory Committee, otherwise referred to as EPAC, they'll be guiding the capacity expansion and the selection of those CapEx scenarios. So in order to maintain currently proposed timelines, scenarios will need to be narrowed down to 3 distinct scenarios. And on a side note, an important aspect of capacity expansion modeling is that it includes zonal transfer limitations as an input in its decision making. So this may not appear to be relevant right now, but this may come into play later in today's discussion. And moving on, the decision for those 3 CapEx scenarios will be based on a number of varying considerations listed out here. Those include, of course, the New York ISO interconnection queue. I think that was part of the question, right? NYSERDA procurement data, public policy transmission projects, any expected generator retirements, the LIPA's resource planning studies, those LTPs that are mentioned, which wouldn't innately include any approved phase 2 projects. Forecasted DER, I know that's been a topic of discussion. That gets incorporated as part of the decision making. Local headroom results as applicable as well. And then, of course, last but not least, stakeholder feedback and developer interest. And then the output, just so there's kind of level set understanding of what those CapEx scenarios spit out. That's going to include like a type and magnitude of generation by zone. And then in addition to that, it will capture when that generation gets installed and when generation gets retired. On top of all that, it also captures capital versus operating costs, and it should provide indication of areas with economic generation opportunity. So stage 2 takes those respective CapEx outputs and develops a nodal model equivalent for them. That's accomplished through use of the New York ISO database, the New York ISO Gold Book, and FERC 715 cases. And it's probably important to note that DER and electrification, along with other projections, of course, are innately captured within that. And then for each respective CapEx scenario, what we're currently envisioning is a short circuit case to be developed, along with a total of 12 power flow cases, which that's going to be broken down in later slides as to what that consists of. And then for each respective case, of course, we'll have to develop contingency files that correlate to the same. And then finally, any utility-specific T&D system representations will be developed as applicable to each of those respective cases. And a good reference point, if you will, for like kind of this workload is the New York ISO database update. That's a 6-month-long process for some context. And then the output of this stage will be a set of study cases for each of those 3 CapEx scenarios. So this brings us to stage 3, which is the assessment stage. This is the largest stage of the Cgpp process as we envision it. And we have that broken down into 3 parts. It starts off with local assessment and identification of any local solution synergies, and then a statewide system impact review. The inputs for this stage are the study cases output from stage 2, of course, which include those 12 load flow cases. And that's based on a combination of light load, shoulder load, winter peak, summer peak, and all that for 3 different study years. What we're envisioning for the first cycle of Cgpp is 2030, 2035, and 2040 years. And that's what essentially makes up those 12 load flow cases I referred to before. And the final output of this assessment stage is going to be a draft statewide system study report. So the first part of the assessment stage is going to, as I mentioned before, the local system assessment of those 3 CapEx scenarios. And that's using the study cases, of course, developed in stage 2. Through short circuit and load flow analysis, constraints on the local systems will be identified. And then through that, viable solutions to the identified constraints will be identified. And we plan to break those down into different categories of solutions, which I don't know if, for those that aren't familiar, some of these terms come from that straw proposal for headroom assessment. So those categories are on-ramps, which look to support transfer of energy from lower voltage to higher voltages. In contrast to that, off-ramps, which support transfer of energy from high voltage to low voltage. And then internal solutions, which facilitate transfer of energy at the same voltage level. And then, of course, we'll be considering non-wire alternatives and solutions to those identified constraints. All potential solutions, this is really important to hit home. This requires iterative analysis to ensure that they're viable and sufficient. That process includes consideration of different solutions for any given constraint, as well as the varying constraints identified for each respective case. And that process also requires a planning engineer assessment of the constraints individually collectively and across each of the 12 scenarios. This in turn, that requires further case development. It also requires, applicable updates to contingency files. And that's not unique to only the solutions being considered, but also the relevant case years the solutions look to address. Now, this effort is repeated until a complete set of local solutions is determined to be viable and sufficient to the respective CapEx scenarios. On top of all this, once local solutions are deemed viable and sufficient, they'll begin a very time-intensive assessment of feasibility and cost. To the extent applicable, solutions that resolve multiple scenarios will be identified and considered. And then one small note before moving on is that we recognize a possibility for stability concerns, and the team is still reviewing the need for stability assessment as it pertains to the Cgpp and where and how it may be incorporated. The second part of the assessment stage looks to identify local solution and synergies. Those sets of local solutions from the local system assessment are put through a qualitative review, and that's done in an effort to identify potential synergies between local solutions. This step will likely require its own iterative assessment to ensure viability and sufficiency of cost-effective solutions. And cost-effective adjustments to those solutions will be performed as needed to output sets of preferred local solutions. So that brings us to the final step of the assessment stage, which will conduct a statewide system impact review. Those sets of preferred local solutions from the previous step will be studied at the state level, and that's to identify any adverse impact on both neighboring systems and the BPS. As needed, solutions will be modified to mitigate those adverse impacts identified. And important note is the end goal of the Cgpp will be focused on resolving local constraints. But to the extent local system limitations are identified, they will be documented. This is largely anticipated due to the zonal transfer limits captured in the capacity expansion decision-making, which looks to avoid creating those needs. So I mentioned that before in stage one, right, where those zonal transfer limits, with those modeled as inputs, the CapEx program would look to avoid increasing above those limitations, right? So innately, our anticipation is the output of the CapEx program would not identify or create, rather, bulk system needs. And then the final output of the assessment stage, as previously mentioned, we'll have a draft statewide system study report. All right, so stage 4 just consists of a review of those results and findings of the report, and then comments will be solicited and addressed as applicable in an effort to finalize, that report. Stage 5 is a least cost plan assessment. And this stage will take the relevant cost and benefit information of those transmission solutions, and that will be evaluated for cost effectiveness. Someone might be off mute. That cost effectiveness will include consideration of dollars per megawatt for cost of solutions, incremental amount of deliverable energy that it creates, reduction of curtailment, and the corresponding capacity of additional generation that can be interconnected. And the output of this stage is going to be a least cost plan. So the final stage of the Cgpp looks to take that least cost plan report, and then it will be used to identify and rank sets of transmission solutions needed to ensure timely and cost-effective attainment of those CLCPA policy goals. And that's under the various generation build-out scenarios. And then finally, the report will identify bulk system limitations and provide accurate and actionable information to the PSC. So I'm going to take a moment to digest all of that, because that's going to segue right into what we envision as potential touch points. for process alignment. The system resource, let's start there. Yeah, so system and resource outlook effort, that's a biennial effort that we see as a natural alignment to the CapEx and the selection of CapEx scenarios. That's made in coordination with the development of scenarios, otherwise known as stage 1. And then of course, the New York ISO database update effort, that's an obvious tie-in to the database development that we see for stage 2, or scenario database development. Any relevant information from the New York ISO public policy process would look to feed into, or at least inform, the assessment that gets completed as part of stage 3. And lastly, approved CGP future phase 2 projects will naturally feed back into future system resource outlook runs, that New York ISO database updates, as mentioned, once it comes firm or gets an LTP, that triggers, an update to the database. And then of course, NYSERDA RFP development. This is done in addition to informing any current or future public policy process, which is that dotted line in gray. And what this does, this forms a cyclical relationship where both NYSERDA and New York ISO efforts feed back into the CGPP, while each successive CGPP also feeds back to those respective New York ISO and NYSERDA efforts. And then for the final slide of this presentation, we wanted to discuss the potential evolution of our proposed CGPP. I mean, it's recognized that this is an extremely comprehensive effort, right? It may not satisfy each and every specific concern, nor do we expect to be a perfect run the first go around. This is why we felt it prudent to really highlight that as we work together on this process, we welcome stakeholder feedback and look to incorporate any lessons learned applicable to future CGPP runs. And that goes for each of the 6 stages of the CGPP. Beyond that generality, we also see some natural evolution points that come with this process, which we want to touch on. So it's anticipated that stage 2 and stage 3 efforts will initially be supported by a consultant. And then as Zach alluded to earlier, we'll be working with New York ISO in an attempt to really maximize their support in an effort to kind of carry over and maintain that continuity and efficiency that really exists today with our existing processes. And then scenario selection will also evolve based off of previous CGPP runs, as well as in any future system resource outlook runs, which was touched on previously. Lastly, approved phase 2 projects will be direct feedback into the selection of scenarios, as well as incorporated into stage 2 database development. And then through your feedback in this corresponding evolution of the CGPP, we envision that each successive CGPP run will build upon the last, sequentially minimizing uncertainties and really progressing towards an optimal transmission and generation build out for CLCPA goals. All right, so this brings us to the last slide. I'd like to thank you all for listening to our presentation, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Nick. That was I thought that was very, very informative. We do have a couple of questions in the chat, and I'll start with those. And then I think it probably makes sense if we can swing it to let people unmute if they have questions, follow-up questions. Just want to be careful that we're not talking over each other, so I'll try to keep track. So here's an early question that came in while you were talking. Let's see. So least cost solutions. Do you differentiate between local and bulk needs, and an assessment as to whether a competitively solicited regional solution might be the least cost for consumers and perhaps more easily expandable for future needs? Do you have any thoughts about that, Nick?
Yeah, the quick and dirty is the focus is on least cost for those local constraints. Ideally, the bulk isn't created by the local, but that is envisioned to be looked at and identified as part of stage 3C. Does that answer the individual's question? A follow-up?
Came from John Cordy. John, did you have a follow-up to that?
And Nick, no, I was just trying to clarify. So if you have multiple projects on the local side, and they may involve something 230 kV and above, you've mentioned that you would do a least cost solution assessment, and is there any move to look at like the hierarchy that's instantiated in Order 1000, that perhaps a single regional project may address many local projects, but then it has the ability to look at both local expansion and future needs and bulk expansion and future needs, that may be a superior solution, and as being a singular project could be at least cost to consumers. That's where I was trying to go to.
Yeah, so that's a good question, John. With that recognized kind of gray area, if you will, by specific voltage level, I would suggest that our aim is not to dictate or determine that, as much as focus in on those local constraints and come up with least cost solutions that we think appropriate. And then, from there, we hand off to the PSC, and to the extent they see, as previously mentioned, well, maybe some of these can be replaced by a bulk, then I would envision I'm sorry, Liz was talking about, I would envision they would look at that.
No, you're putting, everybody is pointing to, a key step in the process, like how do we generate, how do we generate the bulk system, identify the bulk system needs, and how and when do we generate the solutions? Those, I think, we're in a gray area because the team hasn't worked that out yet, and that's part of what we're hoping to accomplish over the next number of months with input from stakeholders. Let me just drop to the next question, which came from Bill Acker. How many load scenarios will be run with the 3 generation scenario?
So we're looking at 4 different load scenarios for each respective year, and that was the light load, the shoulder load, the winter peak, summer peak.
Winter and summer. Okay.
Actually, Liz, can I just quick follow up that Nick could say? I realize in your power flow analysis, you're going to run particular load cases, those light load, heavy load. What I was getting or trying to tease out was to understand if you're going to look at all at future differences geographically in load, meaning one area, growing much faster in load for electrification than another area, for instance.
Well, if I hear you correctly, I think you're really hitting on our stage 1, where the settings and parameters for that CapEx can tweak some of those parameters, right, based off of projections that fall outside the nominal, if you will, and then that would be fed into as a scenario that gets assessed in further detail.
I guess I was understanding the CapEx scenarios being around generation and having 3 of those. Are you saying that there would be different load scenarios also that would be played out with those 3 generation scenarios in the 3, or is there like a 3 by 3?
That's a possibility. It's really, the EPAC to kind of, get to that roundtable, right? Have that discussion of what should the focus points be for these scenarios? What should we be tweaking, right? Beyond like what I would call just like a kind of a nominal projection that we're working off of. Like that projections are innately, not perfect, right? So maybe we want to tweak some of those, some projections. It could be an acceleration of electrification, for instance, right? Or deferment of that acceleration. All of those parameters, well, I shouldn't say all, I shouldn't be all inclusive, but those parameters in particular, I envision is on the table for that discussion and decision making.
So on the table is clearly much more than 3 scenarios than I think I'm hearing you say, and I guess you're warning us that there's resource limitation and challenges with timing for running more than 3 scenarios. But it strikes me at least that there's going to be a need for a lot more than 3 scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's be clear, and that's why we, in my mind, why I really liked ending on that evolution stage, with that slide rather, because it builds upon the last, right? So if you didn't get your scenarios that you wanted specifically in the first cycle, let's say, then the next cycle round, based off those results, and that it wasn't captured the first run, that's on the table for the next run.
Bill, when Nick talks about EPAC, just to make sure everybody knows, that's the proposed stakeholder advisory group that the utilities have included in their filing as a component of the CGPP process. Just for clarity.
Thank you, Liz.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. So, don't get me wrong, Bill, we've still got a lot ahead of us. But is that roughly kind of answer or kind of get to the heart of your question?
Yeah, I do think, and I appreciate you really thinking this through, Nick, and getting to the point that FERC's kind of pointing out of the real importance of looking out 20 years and carrying that to the local transmission planning process. It does strike me that when we're looking at those longer time horizons, we're going to need to have a broader array of scenarios, and I appreciate kind of the incrementality of building on things, but I also believe that we're probably going to have to look at a pretty broad array of scenarios that don't necessarily build on each other because we're looking at this. So I expect we're going to have a healthy discussion there, but I really appreciate you're thinking in that direction already.
Yeah, absolutely. Still got a lot ahead of us.
So almost a perfect segue. Jim DeAndrea asks, how do the proposed CGPP scenario studies align or compare or contrast with the scenario studies that FERC is proposing in the NOPR? Is that something, Nick, you feel comfortable responding to?
No, I haven't had an opportunity really to dive that much into the NOPR. I mean, as always, to the extent we can align, we would look to. That's my response to that question.
Yeah.
Liz?
Was there a question?
Yeah, Liz, it's Jim.
Hey, Jim.
So maybe just what I want to do is follow up. I'm trying to understand the line of jurisdiction and how this could actually ever be compartmentalized into something that wasn't touching FERC's jurisdiction compared to, there's always these overlaps, which is how I see the processes, how they've been going forward, currently, and that's really what we're looking for, is kind of this joint effort. I guess I'm concerned that I don't see how the CGPP, in the breadth that it's being proposed, could kind of be just a state jurisdictional issue.
Well, Jim, jurisdictional questions are kind of, we can park those. I mean, I think just at a really high level, I would expect that, as the NOPR gets finalized, that we'll be talking to the NISO, and that between our respective, what do you want to call them, within our, that the totality of what we are doing here will comply with whatever FERC requires of the NISO.
Yeah, I agree with that. And any studies are just so, I guess I'm thinking they're very broad and we all want to be comprehensive, that it's impossible for one side to ignore the other. So I'm glad to hear that.
No. This is a very, if you haven't been part of the process to date, this is a very, the whole point behind the commission's orders setting this up was to emphasize the need for better and increasingly close coordination.
Thanks, Liz.
So the NISO has been part of these discussions from the beginning. And then there's a question from Tim London about my earlier statement about the CGPP process providing the commission with information to help identify public policy needs. Your statement, Nick, I think on slide 14, that the CGPP process will not produce bulk system solutions. What information would then be used from CGPP would be used to identify potential bulk system project? I'm gonna, Nick, if you don't mind, I'm gonna take a first crack at answering that. And then if you have anything you want to follow up with, please do. But my first crack at answering that is, this is the area that requires some definition in our process, in the process that we're building. But I think what we would be trying to do would be to give the commission, the commission would have the same role that it has today, that is to identify where there are public policies driving transmission needs around the state, and that the commission would be able to make that determination based on information provided in the CGPP, which would not necessarily be potential bulk system solutions, but rather the underpinnings for the same assessment that the commission performs today. Does that help answer your question? Dan?
Yeah, Liz, I think it does. Thank you.
Okay.
And I think, as you said, as we get further down the road on this, we'll get more information about it as well. So,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. We're not proposing to change the commission's role in the Order 1000 universe, but rather to kind of rationalize where the information comes from. And put that in the context of a statewide assessment. Nick, did you want to say anything about that?
I think you said it much more eloquently than I did.
I love the gray areas. Ann Reynolds. Ann, did you have a separate question from the one that you actually typed out?
Did, yeah, I had two.
Okay. Well, you're allowed to.
The one I typed was about timing. The other one was about what two other people have asked about where in this process does it result in a bulk solution. And I wanted to ask it rather than type it, because I wanted to say that my questions might seem to imply that we have some sort of preference for a bulk solution, and we definitely do not. If all the local solutions are sufficient to get the renewables deployed and delivered that New York needs, then that's great. But what I'm worried about happening is, and it sounds like it's not going to, but that we get to the end of the process and have a group of phase 2 projects that were all local, and that there would be critics who would say, well, there's a bulk solution that's better, and we wouldn't know the answer to that question. So just to follow up on your answer to that last one, Liz, do you think that the outputs of stage 2 would be enough for the commission to then know, okay, here's a place or a year or a scenario in which we need to solicit bulk solutions? Because my interpretation of stage 3 is that it doesn't result in any bulk solutions. Even the stage 3C is just looking at the adverse impacts of the local solutions on other places. So it really would be sort of an exit ramp from the stages, at which point the commission would say, looks like we need to declare a public policy transmission need. And I wanted to see if I was interpreting that correctly.
So we don't have the answer yet. I mean, that's what I've been trying to say, is that exactly how the bulk system need information gets generated through this process, we haven't, I don't see that in here yet. And it's something that staff wants to, that should be, from our point of view, one of the outputs of this process, not solutions. Let's be careful here. We do want the utilities to identify local solutions, because we have set up a separate process outside of the rate case scenario for utilities to bring forward those local solutions for potential funding. So we definitely want the CGPP to produce specific local solutions. That's part of the purpose. But a second purpose is also to generate information about where bulk system needs are may be emerging. And we haven't figured out exactly, at what point in the process that's been outlined, at what point does that happen? So we want to have further, discussion about that. And again, just to kind of fall back on my Order 1000 vocabulary, we want the commission to say, we see there's a need for transmission. And then we want the NISO to do what it does and solicit the solutions. Right? You follow the distinction I'm making?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. And then that sort of gets back to the PPTN cycle, which was sort of the reason for my timing question too.
Yep. Please go ahead. So what's the timing of the cycle? Is that what you were asking?
My question was, Nick said at one of the earlier slides that this will be done by the end of the year. And I didn't know if he was referring to one of the stages or all of the stages.
This is Nick. I can take that one, Liz.
Yep.
Yeah, that's for the detailed process, which would incorporate all the stages.
Okay, so by the end of the year is just the finalization of what the process will be, and then in 2023 you would be embarking on the actual scenario development and analysis.
Well, so once we have PSC approval, then we'll be looking to embark upon that. Yes.
Yeah, if I could respond to that as well. We've, the utilities we're engaging in these technical conferences and any follow-up. And the utilities are continuing to work with NISO and NYSERDA on details, and we expect a revised CGPP process filing at the end of this year. And we are hoping that, assuming commission approval, that the first cycle of the CGPP would kick off in 2023.
Was there a previous order that said that the phase 2 projects have to be proposed the end of this calendar year?
Yes. The utilities are under a deadline to propose their first portfolio of phase 2 solutions in January of 23, which is in advance of completing this, planning process. So they're developing that portfolio using, I don't want to speak for them, but, using their, existing normal tools so that there will be a phase 2 portfolio filed at the beginning of January.
Okay, so that's helpful to understand. So yeah, and then the commission will consider those phase 2 proposals even while the CGPP process is getting started.
Yep, we will unpack that filing and start working on it. Yep.
Thank you.
Non-stop fun.
Non-stop, exactly. We have a couple more questions. Oh, John Cordy again. How does the bulk grid study required by our reg BCA, that's my favorite statute, and presumably incorporating that and be incorporated, okay. John, you're referring to the Accelerated Renewable Energy something growth and community benefit act or something, which requires, well, we did the bulk grid study, the power grid study we did. That was the study that was required under that statute. What we're engaged with here now is developing the plan that is required by that statute. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and maybe I'm misunderstanding. My understanding in this statute was that it required what I'll describe as a local distribution and local transmission needs study, which was the power grid study. I thought it also required a similar assessment on the bulk side. And, I guess you're hearing a bunch of questions where we're just trying to figure out how does the local and the bulk and how is, how are ratepayers best served by projects that may be larger? And, I thought there were these 2 studies required by REGBA, and we haven't gotten there yet. So I wonder if that's like a missing bogey, at least in my thinking, Liz, between the current process and the NISO PPTP process.
The commission has to be able to point to a bulk system plan, and all the utilities have to have local and distribution level plans. And that's what we're working towards here.
Okay, thanks. So maybe I'll call you offline and talk that through.
And that's why, one of the reasons why I'm saying here, the plan, the process outline that the utilities have on the table addresses the local transmission needs, but we have kind of this gray area of how are we going to incorporate the identification of bulk needs, because that would seem to be part of that seems to be part of what the legislature was after.
Yeah, and I guess that's the part you're hearing a lot of us just kind of struggling is differentiating that line. We've gotten guidance with FERC order 888, where we had the 7-factor test, and then we've got the 100 kV BES definition, and then ISO generally works with a 230 kV differentiation, and it's kind of coming to where that is. I guess that's where a lot of the questions are. So,
and again, we've tried to be clear that we want to use all the tools in the toolkit.
Yep. Thank you.
Liz, are you taking questions from the phone?
At this point, I think we should open up the phones. Yeah.
Okay, it's Howard Fromer. I just want to make sure I'm sort of understanding at the 30,000 foot level what's being contemplated. And let me just start with, is the intention of the utility process to take the inputs that come out of the New York ISO's planning activities, particularly load forecasts, 20-year assumptions about, electrification, et cetera, and then use that data to do their local planning? Or are they, because I heard them say they're going to hire consultants, and I didn't know whether they're envisioning coming up with their own forecasts and assumptions that could be in conflict with where the ISO is. And I guess it's a long way of getting to concern over consistency with competitive markets, which ultimately planning is a critical part of. And it's all got to work together so that we end up with ultimately market signals being, reliable, and predictable, and not having expectations undermined by different assumption sets that the utilities going to the PSC for approval work off of. So anyway, long concern.
Yeah, good question. Easy for me to say, we're aiming for a high degree of coordination, but Nick, you want to answer that?
Sure, I'll take a crack at it, and this one I'll open up for the JUs, because this one is one of those things that is to some degree unique, right, for each utility. To get to the heart of your question, yes, we do take those New York ISO database and look to build off of them to achieve the study cases necessary to complete this work. And then in regards to locally, right, we have to refer to each local utility. They would follow their practices in regards to tweaking the forecast. Beyond that, I don't think everyone necessarily does do that, but I know, for instance, for LIPA, right, we model our non-coincident load forecast into our study cases. So that is one tweak that we would make to adhere to our local criteria level.
Which I think our load forecasting at the ISO does. I mean, they work consistently with the TOs. I just want to be sure that you don't have the state ISO moving forward with one view of the future, that they're setting up their system to work to, provide reliability, and then the TOs are going off with a completely different view of what's happening.
Yeah, sure, Howard. I think this is important context here. Those New York ISO, the database updates, those cases that come out of that, that's a coincident for peak load for the state level, right? So I think it is prudent, right, that we look at our local areas and
Well, they have
plan for
locational.
are non-coincident. I'm sorry, did I miss the mark? Are you looking for something else?
Well, they do locational calculations annually as well to come up with, the capacity requirements. So, ultimately, you're going to have a view of what is necessary to maintain reliability, both on a statewide basis and for each of our localities. And, in terms of what's the IRM, LCR, as you're looking out over some significant period. I think you said 20 years. So we just need to be sure that we don't create unintended consequences by two parallel systems that have different decision makers leading to, capital investments.
I don't know if this reassures you or not, but essentially it continues to align with the existing processes that we follow today.
Yeah, and this is Chris Sherman from Avangrid. The intention is not for the CGBP to replace any existing processes. We would still be performing our regular reliability analyses, and this would simply be an additional study added on top of this. It's not going to replace any existing studies that are specific to maintaining system reliability. I don't know if that was clear.
And when you do your sort of thinking about resource adequacy and what's likely to be added in your locality, are you going to be making cost assumptions about what is it going to cost 15 years from now to deliver certain types of resources, to understand, what's coming in, and whether, in the highest level, is offshore wind as cost effective, or more cost effective than building out upstate renewables with transmission, and how do those play off against each other? I mean, are you going to be using the ICE numbers?
This is Nick. That innately, my understanding is, right, that the CapEx or stage one, and also the system resource outlook, right, those parameters are settings in that effort. So those will be captured, and I would, I can't speak for New York ICE, but I assume that will be discussed, right, what those assumptions are, and be vetted out, with stakeholders accordingly.
Okay, which we do now as part of what we're doing right now in the economic planning process that has been vastly expanded to try and answer many of these questions, certainly on the bulk level. And if this is a effort to, on a local level, basically be developing something that's consistent with, what's being assumed for the bulk, this makes perfect sense.
Thanks, I'm sorry.
One at a time.
I'm sorry, Howard, are you done?
Yes, thanks.
Liz, can I follow up on something that Chris said in response to Howard's questions?
Who's speaking?
It's Kevin Lang.
Oh, hi, Kevin. Yeah, sure. Please. Go ahead.
Thanks. I had a question, not on the same issue of Howard of bulk versus local, but really of local versus local, in that this process seems to be very focused on system needs to accommodate new resources for the CLCPA, which I get, but there's another need, which is serving customers. And Chris's response to Howard was this study gets layered on the others. And I'm just curious, how do you go about, or will this process look at not just the needs for the CLCPA, but what your needs are to serve customers to ensure from a least cost perspective that you're really serving both needs? In other words, let's say you have a transmission need to bolster an area to serve your customers reliably that potentially could also serve to support CLCPA. will there be a way that all of those issues can be looked at together?
Kevin, can I try it says I'm going to try a partial
Sure.
answer to that, and then the JU may have, you know, other answers. If you look back at the prior steps in this proceeding, the commission specifically identified the the possibility that local projects done for to serve customers might have CLCPA benefits, and we call those phase 1 projects. And the commission told the utilities to be sure to look for those potential multi-value investments and to bring them forward in the rate cases. And even said, if there's a timing, a CLCPA driven timing issue, utilities are authorized to seek approval for phase 1 projects through petitions. And the commission has 2 such petitions on its plate today. So if your question is, do we recognize that that there's multi-value to some traditional projects? The answer is yes.
No, I wasn't talking about today, Liz. I was actually talking about the future, because needs are going to change and evolve over time, particularly with electrification.
Mm-hmm.
And the phase 1 projects are based on what the utilities know today, but 3 years, 5 years from now, they might see different sets of needs. This process, the Cgpp process, is a 2-year cycle that sounds like it's going to be repeating over time. So my question is more towards, as this process goes forward through time, will it be able to identify those other system needs and make sure that it's coming up with the best solution to satisfy all needs?
Okay, well, I'll let Nick and any others respond.
And so I might ask you to repeat that after I say what I was going to say, because I think you're hitting on something different than what I was initially going to mention. But
Sure.
my initial response, and just let me know if this is off the mark. It might be. My initial response is that load is representative of our customers, and that is captured in our studies. And then in regards to variance thereof, that would that's a potential variable that gets tweaked as part of the CapEx scenario selection. So in that fashion, I was envisioning that we are taking that consideration. But are you trying to hit on something else?
No, well, I'm not sure. That's why I was asking the question. Let's just look at electrification. That there's projections that electrification could add tens of thousands of megawatts of demand to the system. That might require new transmission. And I was just trying to understand the interplay, since if I look at your slide 15, it's talking about identifying transmission solutions to achieve the CLCPA. I have no issue with that. But there might also be transmission needs to serve that additional load. And I was just trying to understand if the Cgpp would look at both pieces on a forward basis, not today basis.
I think the answer is yes.
Okay.
Kevin? The challenge is to plan for meeting CLCPA, and that includes understanding the implications of electrification.
Okay. Thank you.
And somebody asked about presentations being online, and yes, they will. A couple of them were already posted, and I think, yeah, they will all be available online. Do we have other questions from the group?
Liz, this is Al Page.
Yep.
You hear me?
Yep, I do.
I'm just wondering how in this planning process, which is going to be unusually extensive, how do you rope in the legislature and the governor? So, and I'm being ridiculous with this, so that, for example, the legislature doesn't come out and say, well, we want 6,000 megawatts of offshore wind in Lake Erie. or somewhere else in the state. How do you tie them in so that they're aware of how extensive and time consuming this entire process is?
If I knew how to do that, I'd be in a different place. We can't rope in or tie down the governor or the legislators. We are trying to build a process that will enable us to, well, certainly enable us to show how we are doing with respect to the targets we have today. But you know, if those targets change or things get added to the mix, we'll have to react. So that's an unsatisfying answer, probably.
What can you say, right?
If somebody decides there should be, you know, a whole lot of stuff in Lake Erie that we don't have any reason to be planning for now, we'll have to make adjustments. So if we don't have any other specific questions.
Liz, this is Ron Leonard. I have a question.
Sure.
I'm curious to make sure that I understood what you said. And by the way, thanks for herding the cats. The question that I have is, you see the 6 stages starting to actually come to fruition next year? And if so, under this entire proposal, who's the grown-up in the room? And specifically, I'm asking whether it's the Public Service Commission, whether it's the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, whether the utilities are going to be dominant. Have they been in the past? The utilities want to have $16 billion of grid upgrades, which I think is dubious. How does this work out logistically? Logistically, from the point of view of there has to be a governing body that oversees everything. Is that truly the Public Service Commission, or is the Climate Leadership Council or others taking over a role here that I don't understand?
Yeah, I can only answer that question in the context of, you know, what the commission has done here so far. The commission has authority to provide for system planning. The commission is exercising that authority in this proceeding and expects the results of the planning process to be brought back to the commission with recommendations for, you know, specific investments, including recommendations for possible bulk transmission needs. And the commission would exercise its traditional authority to review and approve or disapprove the investments recommended as a result of this process.
And you think that's probably the beginning of next year?
Well, the beginning next year, the commission will be reviewing the first portfolio of the first general portfolio of phase 2 projects. This planning process will probably kick off at some point next year. So there will be, you know, if it takes 2 years, there will be, you know, there will be a second set of submissions approximately 2 years after that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Right. But Liz, isn't the ultimate answer that the commission has to approve rate recovery for investments, and that's their ultimate control? If they think 16 billion or whatever the number was that was hypothetically mentioned was too much, that's how they could prevent that from occurring.
Well, that's why we're asking. That's why we're asking for an overview of the system needs, so we can make, so the commission can make, you know, look at cost-effective solutions.
And the commission has already said that 16 billion is far-reaching.
I don't know that the commission has said anything about any numbers. I don't know where you get that from.
I'll send it to you, Liz.
Okay, so so thanks to all the presenters. I thought that was a terrific some really good packages of information for folks. And I'd just like to repeat the invitation that Tammy expressed earlier, which is, you know, we are happy to bring people together again in a small group setting for, you know, further drill down into details of how these processes will you know, can be or could be lined up, and you know what the overall Gantt chart might look like. If there's, you know, if there's significant interest in pursuing some of those kinds of questions. We are going to be hosting additional general tech conferences on other planning topics. So you should be aware of that. But if people have more deep dive questions around the process alignment issues, please let me know. I'll put my email in the chat if you don't have it. Please let me know, and we'll kind of, you know, work with you to see if we have some, you know, concrete questions that we can bring up in a follow-up setting. Here's my email address. And we will, you know, convene further discussion if it looks like that would be productive. So are there any further questions or concerns before we wrap?
Yeah.
Yep.
Liz, could you post, or maybe the ISO could put on its website somewhere, a link to all these presentations?
We have a page that Jalila referred to on our website for this effort.
Yeah, the link to that would be fine. Some of us are not following something. I'm not following, so maybe others are, but.
This is Pete Casper. I just posted it in the chat if people want to pull it from the chat to the DMM site.
Yep. But yeah, well, we'll see if we can. We'll talk to the NISO, see if there's a way we can make it easy. Great. Well, thanks again.
I mean, that's kind of odd, Liz, Carl. I mean, we're happy to help, of course, but you know, everything that's be posted in under 20E0197, the case number for this proceeding.
Yeah.
So I mean, Howie, that's where you would find the material.
Yeah, everything's there.
Oh, okay, I got the link, and that's fine. Perfect. Thanks.
Okay. Great. Question asked and answered. Thanks to the presenters. Thanks to all the participants. Is Tammy on? Do you want to say any closing remarks? Might have had to disappear. Looks like maybe she did. So keep an eye on the proceeding. We'll be noticing the further tech conferences. We're probably going to do at least one a month for a bit. And again, if you think a follow-on discussion around the process alignment issues would be useful, do let me know. With that, everybody should have a break for lunch, and hope to see y'all soon.
Thanks, Liz.
Bye.
Bye.
Liz, thanks all. Have a great weekend.